Hi, class. This is a brief overview of the one-way ANOVA module. The one-way ANOVA is basically a straightforward extension of the independent samples t-test we discussed in the last module. Whereas in the independent t-test, we were looking at differences between two groups. For the one-way ANOVA, we're extending that to 3 or more groups. I mean, you can actually think of the independent t-test as just a special case of the one-way ANOVA. The ratings for the week, make sure everybody reads through my notes. I gave you an additional handout on various post-hoc tests. I talked about a few of them in my notes. The Graviter and Walnu book discusses, I think, a couple. I think they discuss Tukey and the Chaffee method in the Graviter and Walnu book. This little document discusses several different post-hoc tests. So just real quick, what is a post-hoc test? So when you run the one-way ANOVA, it's going to give you what's called like it's going to give you just an overall test of whether any of the group means are different, but it doesn't tell you which of the groups are different from each other. So you would typically run a post-hoc test to then determine, well, since there is a difference between the groups, where is that? Where is that difference? And you'll see that if you look through, as you read through my notes, I start off talking about, if we have more than two groups, why can't we just run multiple t-tests comparing? So say we have 3 groups, we want to compare, why can't we just do a t-test between group 1 and 2 and group 1 and 3? The problem with that is, you want to, it inflates your type 1 error rate. So, we set an alpha level. By setting our alpha level at 0.05, we say we're willing to accept a 5% chance of making a type 1 error. When you conduct multiple t-tests, it multiplies that type 1 error. So the ANOVA controls for the type 1 error at whatever value you set it at. So if we're setting our alpha level at 0.05, then that's what the ANOVA keeps it at. So you can read through that in a little bit more detail. Here you can see the null hypothesis for for a one-way ANOVA is that all the group means are equal. So here we had 3 group means against the alternative that some pair of group means are different. A little discussion here. Why is it called an analysis of variance? I thought we were comparing group means. Actually, what we're doing is we're decomposing the total variation in the outcome into variation that's due to differences between the groups and variability that's due to differences within the groups. We consider the within group variability to be error variability, or just variation that's due to random sampling fluctuations or individual differences. If there really was a treatment effect or there really was a difference between the groups, we'd expect that to show up in the between groups variation, or the sums or squares between. So the ANOVA is actually an F test. That's a ratio of the within and between group differences. So I kind of discussed through that here. In the notes here, I'll walk through an example. I compute the ANOVA by hand. I'm not expecting you to actually compute an ANOVA by hand. We're going to use, for the data analysis assignment, we're going to use SPSS for the assignment. Now, if you want to do it by hand for the assignment, that's fine, but it's not required. So in the notes here, you can see I run through an example where I calculate everything by hand, but then I also have an SPSS document where I go through the same example, but actually do it in SPSS, show you how to do it there. I talk a little bit about testing the assumptions. We have the same homogeneity of variance assumption. Remember, I was talking about the ANOVA is just a straightforward extension of the independent samples t-test. So we make the same assumptions as we do in the independent samples t-test. So I talk about what happens here, consequences for violating those assumptions. So we have our effect sizes. Again, remember I said that all of these same concepts that we discussed with hypothesis testing, we're going to use over and over again. And then I'll talk a little bit about the post hoc test. Oops. I have a couple other documents that I've found online that I thought would be helpful to you. So this understanding the one-way ANOVA, this author, he sort of goes through, sort of like I do in my notes, the different aspects of the one-way ANOVA. He actually goes into a little bit more detail in here about testing the different assumptions and the different consequences for violating those assumptions. So one of the things, if you violate the assumption of homogeneity of variance, remember in the one-way ANOVA, we would use what was basically Welch's t-test and made an adjustment to the degrees of freedom. There's the same idea is available in ANOVA, and he discusses that in a little bit more detail in this document. Here's another one where they go through another example, sort of by hand, and then interpreting the actual results. I have another document on here that goes into more detail on various kinds of post hoc tests, and then, you know, different scenarios when you might want to use them. I have an example of a write-up for a one-way ANOVA, so you can see an example how you might write up the results for a one-way ANOVA. I have another example that's very similar to the data analysis assignment. So you can see here's you can practice working the example on your own, and then there's an answer key available on Canvas. Here's my my SPSS handout. This first page really shows you how you enter the data in to SPSS. Notice how it's typed in. Remember, the columns in SPSS represent our groups, our variables. Sorry, or really we put our variables in the columns, and each individual is in a row. So in this data set, there are 30 participants or 30 subjects. Now, the 30 subjects are in 3 groups. So notice we have the first 10 subjects are in group 1. The next 10 subjects are in group 2, and then the final 10 subjects are in group 3. So that's how they're labeled. And here's their score on whatever the outcome is in this example. And then you go to analyze, compare means, one-way ANOVA. I kind of show you what all you can check here. If you don't meet the assumption of homogeneity of variance, you could check this little box that says Welch, and it'll give you the Welch's correction. And then there's how you kind of interpret the output from an ANOVA. This document talks about using the Chaffee post hoc, but for a complex comparison, and you'll read about that, what that is in the notes. We generally think of like pairwise comparisons. Group 1 is group 1 different than group 2? Is group 1 different than group 3? A complex comparison would be like, is group 1 different than both groups 2 and 3 together? So say you have one experimental condition and 2 control groups. You could test whether the experimental condition is different than both of the other control groups, or vice versa. 2 experimental conditions and 1 control group. Is a control group different than the other 2 experimental conditions? And I talk about that a little bit more in the notes. As always with each module, there is a quiz and a data analysis assignment. I've also linked in here several videos. The Khan Academy video kind of works it out by hand. here's, a couple of videos of how to run a one-way ANOVA in SPSS, and then a couple additional like lecture videos that sort of talk about one-way ANOVA in general. As always, if you have any questions or any concerns, shoot me an email or post something on the message board. I'm always available to help. Thank you.